Pull the blankets tightly around your shoulders. Take a deep breath and let the familiar comforts of the modern world dissolve into the freezing dark mist of the late 17th century. We are traveling back to the year 1692, to a small, isolated settlement carved out of the brutal, unforgiving wilderness of New England. This is Salem Village, Massachusetts. Fairy tales and modern Halloween movies have painted the Salem witch trials as a theatrical story of old women riding broomsticks and wearing pointed hats. But the historical reality is infinitely more terrifying. It was a slow-motion psychological collapse of an entire community, driven by absolute isolation, religious extremism, clinical starvation, and a literal physical battle against a frozen frontier that wanted them dead.
To understand why an entire village began hanging its own neighbors, you must first understand the sheer crushing weight of their daily existence. If you were an ordinary settler in Salem in the winter of 1692, your life was not a pastoral romance of simple farming. It was a waking nightmare of survival. Your morning begins at 4:30, long before the sun even hints at rising above the massive, ancient Atlantic forest that encircles your settlement. The air inside your small wooden home is so intensely cold that your breath forms a thick, white cloud before your face, and the water in the wooden bucket beside your hearth has frozen into a solid block of ice overnight. Your home is a crude, dark structure built from hand-hewn oak logs. The windows are tiny, covered not with glass, which is an impossible luxury imported from England, but with thick animal bladders or linen cloth soaked in linseed oil. The lighting is practically non-existent. During the long winter days, your only illumination comes from the flickering, smoky orange glow of the fireplace and the dim, smelly light of tallow candles made from rendered sheep fat. The smoke from the hearth never truly leaves the room. It hangs in a permanent, heavy grey cloud just below the low ceiling, burning your eyes and chest with every single breath you take. You step out of your bed, which is a coarse canvas sack stuffed with rustling corn husks and dried pine needles. Your body is covered in a heavy, stiff wool blanket that hasn't been washed in months, hosting a quiet, invisible army of fleas and body lice that you have simply learned to accept as a part of human anatomy. Your joints ache with a deep, dull pain born from
In Salem, there are no horses for the average peasant, no machinery, and no shortcuts. If a field needs to be cleared, you split the massive stones with an iron sledgehammer and pull the stubborn, frozen tree roots out of the clay with your bare hands until your fingers bleed and your back is permanently misaligned. As you lace your stiff leather boots, you hear the low, mournful howling of wolves echoing from the deep forest just a few hundred yards from your cabin. To the Puritans of Salem, that forest was not just a collection of trees. It was the literal physical kingdom of Satan. They believed that the dark, unexplored wilderness was infested with demons, witches, and the Native American tribes, whom they viewed as the direct soldiers of the devil.
The political reality was just as terrifying. The colony was locked in a brutal, bloody frontier war with the French and the Wabanaki Indians. Just months earlier, nearby settlements had been completely burned to the ground, their inhabitants massacred or taken into the freezing wilderness as captives. Every single night, as you close your wooden door and slide the heavy iron bolt into place, you know that your family could be attacked before the morning sun arrives. You live in a constant, echoing state of low-level post-traumatic stress disorder. Fear is your shadow, and it never, ever leaves your side.
By 6 o'clock in the morning, the family gathers around the rough wooden table for the first meal of the day. But there is no comfort to be found at this table. The Puritans believed that pleasure was a trap set by the devil, to lead souls to damnation, so their food was treated purely as fuel, devoid of flavor, spices, or joy.
Your breakfast consists of a wooden bowl of samp, a thick, tasteless porridge made by boiling coarsely ground dried corn in water, occasionally mixed with a small amount of salted pork fat if the winter supply is holding up. To wash it down, you do not drink water. The shallow wells in Salem village are frequently contaminated by runoff from the nearby animal pens and swampy marshes, leading to sudden, deadly outbreaks of bloody flux and typhoid. Instead, every member of the family, from the hardened grandfather to the 4-year-old child, drinks mugs of hard apple cider or weak sour beer.
But the real psychological fuse of the Salem witch trials lay hidden within the very bread that sat on the table. The winter of 1691 had been unusually wet, cold, and swampy in New England. This specific environment created the absolute perfect breeding ground for a tiny parasitic fungus that grows on rye grain, known as Claviceps purpurea, or more commonly, ergot. Because the settlers were living on the brink of starvation, they could not afford to destroy a single grain of harvest. The infected rye, marked by small, dark, horn-like purple growths, was ground directly into the flour and baked into the heavy loaves of bread consumed by the entire village.
When a human ingests ergot-infected bread, they consume a natural, primitive form of lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The chemical consequences on a deeply religious, isolated, and terrified mind are catastrophic. Ergotism manifests in two terrifying ways: gangrenous and convulsive. In its convulsive form, the central nervous system is entirely overwhelmed. Victims suddenly experience a sensation of crawling ants beneath their skin, intense muscle spasms that contort their limbs into impossible, agonizing shapes, and vivid, terrifying hallucinations of fire, demons, and black animals speaking to them in the dark. Imagine being a young girl in January of 1692 in this environment. You are trapped in a dark, silent house for months due to the freezing New England snow. Your religion tells you every single day from the pulpit that the devil is actively looking for children to sign his black book in blood. You are fed a steady diet of fire and brimstone sermons, told that even your thoughts can send you to the eternal flames of hell, and forbidden from playing games, dancing, or expressing any form of joy.
Then, the biological toxin of the ergot fungus enters your bloodstream. Suddenly, your body begins to twist uncontrollably. You see flashing lights in the dark corners of the room. You feel invisible needles pricking your flesh. To a modern doctor, it is a clear case of chemical poisoning. But to the mind of a 17th century Puritan, there was only one possible explanation. You were being physically attacked by an invisible witch who had traded her soul to
The
Satan.
madness began in the household of Reverend Samuel Barris, where his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began screaming, throwing items across the room, and crawling under furniture in absolute agony. The local physician, Dr. William Griggs, looked at the contorted children, exhausted his primitive medical knowledge, and uttered the 3 words that would seal the fate of 20 innocent people. The evil hand is upon them. The match had been struck, and the dry timber of Salem's collective paranoia was ready to explode into an uncontrollable wildfire.
To understand how this biological and psychological spark turned into a legal execution machine, one must look at the physical heart of the community, the Salem Village Meeting House. In the modern democratic world, we maintain a strict boundary between church and state, between personal faith and the criminal court. In Massachusetts, that boundary did not exist. The church was the government. The Bible was the law book, and a sin against God was legally treated as a capital crime against the state.
Every Sunday, regardless of the weather,
Every man, woman, and child was legally required to sit in the freezing, unheated wooden meeting house for up to 5 hours at a time, listening to sermons that detailed the horrors of damnation. If you fell asleep during the sermon, a church warden would strike you on the head with a long wooden pole tipped with a heavy brass ball. If you missed a service without a severe medical excuse, you were fined, placed in the heavy iron stocks in the public square, and marked by the community as a potential agent of darkness. This intense religious pressure created a society built entirely on suspicion, surveillance, and deep-seated grudges. Because the Puritans believed that God's grace was incredibly selective, that only a small elect group of people would be saved from hell. Everyone was constantly observing their neighbors for any sign of moral failing. Salem village was also deeply divided by bitter, multi-generational property disputes, legal battles over boundaries, and intense hatred towards the local minister, Samuel Parris, who demanded higher wages and free firewood from a community that was already struggling to feed its own children.
When the afflicted girls were pressured by the ministers and judges to name the invisible witches who were torturing them, the social dam broke completely. The girls did not name the wealthy, powerful church elders first. They named the outcasts, the people whom the village already disliked, feared, or found inconvenient. The very first person accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household from the Caribbean. She was the perfect target. Her skin was dark, her language was foreign, and she practiced folk remedies that the Puritans viewed as sorcery. The second was Sarah Good, a homeless, pregnant beggar woman who walked from cabin to cabin asking for food, often muttering curses under her breath when she was turned away from the door. The third was Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman who had scandalized the village by marrying her Irish servant and inheriting her late husband's property, denying it.
On 1st March 1692, the magistrates John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin arrived at the meeting house to conduct the formal examinations. The small wooden room was packed to its absolute limits with terrified, sweating villagers. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed wool, stale dampness, and palpable fear. When the accused women were brought to the front of the room, the afflicted girls were seated in the front rows. The moment Sarah Good looked at them, the girls broke into violent, unified convulsions, screaming that Good's spirit was biting them and pinching them with invisible fingers. Magistrate Hawthorne, a cold, ruthless man whose direct descendant Nathaniel Hawthorne would later write the Scarlet Letter out of sheer family guilt, looked down from his high wooden bench and demanded of Sarah Good, "What deity do you serve? Why do you hurt these poor children?" The trial was not an effort to find the truth. It was a psychological performance where the accused was presumed guilty from the very first breath, and the only evidence required to condemn a human being to the gallows was the invisible, unprovable testimony of a screaming child.
By April of 1692, the air in Salem had grown thick with an absolute, paralyzing terror. The accusations were no longer confined to the outcasts, the beggars, or the enslaved. The wildfire of paranoia had breached the inner sanctuaries of the Puritan elite. Anyone could be next. If you spoke out against the trials, you were accused. If you showed too much pity for a crying prisoner, you were accused. If your cow died unexpectedly or your crops rotted in the field, you simply pointed a finger at your neighbor and claimed their phantom spirit had cursed your land.
The legal machinery of the colony had fully adapted to sustain this madness. The judges introduced a devastating legal concept known as spectral evidence. The logic was as brilliant as it was diabolical. The court believed that the devil could not take the shape of an innocent person without their explicit permission. Therefore, if an afflicted girl screamed that she saw the invisible ghost or specter of a deeply religious church member sitting on the ceiling beam, the court accepted it as absolute, irrefutable proof that the accused had signed a contract with Satan. There was no alibi, no defense, and no logical escape. How do you prove that your invisible spirit is not standing in a room?
The prison conditions in New England during this period were a separate form of torture, designed to break the human spirit before the neck was ever broken on the gallows. The accused were dragged in heavy iron chains to the Salem and Boston jails. These were not stone cells with clean bars. They were dark, suffocating wooden dungeons built over stagnant, mud-filled basements. The air was entirely devoid of oxygen, heavy with the suffocating stench of human waste, rotting straw, and the unwashed, sweating bodies of dozens of prisoners crammed shoulder to shoulder.
The jailers were private entrepreneurs who charged the prisoners for their own maintenance. যদি আপনি একটা পাতে মূর্ছা পাউরুটি বা একটা খারাপ গন্ধযুক্ত জল খেতে চান, তাহলেও আপনাকে একটা তামার কয়েন দিতে হতো। যদি ওই ভারী মরচে দ্বারা গলার পাতলা লোহার শিকল আপনার পায়ের গোড়ালি থেকে ঢিলা করতে চান, তাহলেও আপনাকে পাহারাদারকে ঘুষ দিতে হতো। নিষ্পাপ পরিবারগুলো পুরো বিত্তবান হয়ে গিয়েছিল শুধু তাদের অভিযুক্ত মা আর বোনকে বাঁচিয়ে রাখতে চেষ্টা করতে গিয়ে ঠান্ডা অন্ধকারে।
Among the prisoners was Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known throughout the colony for her immense piety, charity, and quiet dignity. She was so weak from illness that she had to be carried into the courtroom. When the jury initially found her not guilty, the afflicted girls let out a scream so violent and terrifying that the windows of the meeting house rattled. The intimidated judge forced the jury to reconsider their verdict. In Salem, innocence was a luxury the court could no longer afford to recognize.
As the heat of the summer of 1692 settled over Massachusetts, the psychological landscape of Salem village resembled a fever dream. The colonial authorities established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Termina, to fast-track the executions. The town square became an arena of grand theological theatre, where the line between reality and religious hallucination completely dissolved. To maintain the momentum of the trials, the inquisitors relied heavily on extracting confessions. They quickly discovered a cruel flaw in their own system. If an accused person maintained their innocence and insisted they were a true Christian, they were swiftly found guilty and sentenced to hang. But if they confessed to being a witch, wept bitterly, and named other neighbors as co-conspirators, their execution was postponed indefinitely so they could assist the court. The system actively rewarded perjury and punished absolute honesty.
The confessions themselves, recorded in the dry, fading ink of colonial court documents, reveal the sheer depth of the collective hysteria. Under intense psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and the threat of immediate death, ordinary Puritan housewives began describing intricate, terrifying encounters with the supernatural. They spoke of a black man who appeared in the dead of night dressed in formal London clothing, offering them a heavy book written in blood. They confessed to flying through the night sky on poles, attending grand witches' sabbaths in the fields behind Reverend Paris's house, and plotting to overthrow the kingdom of Christ in New England. The psychological weight on the community was crushing. Children were encouraged to testify against their own parents. 7-year-old Dorcas Good was arrested and kept in heavy iron chains for months, forced to testify that her mother, Sarah Good, was a witch who took the form of a black cat. The small child was so deeply traumatized by the dark, rat-infested cell that her mind broke completely. She spent the remaining decades of her life in a state of permanent, weeping insanity. The fabric of family, love, and basic human trust had been entirely incinerated by the fires of religious fanaticism.
On June 10, 1692, the first formal execution took place on a barren, rocky hill outside Salem town, a place that would forever be known in history as Gallows Hill. Bridget Bishop, a woman known for her independent spirit, her ownership of local taverns, and her controversial choice to wear a bright scarlet bodice, was climbed up the wooden ladder. A rough hemp rope,
coarse and abrasive, was tied tightly around her neck. The ladder was turned and her body dropped into the humid summer air. There was no sudden snap of the spine. Medieval and colonial hangings were slow, agonizing deaths by strangulation that lasted for several minutes while the entire village watched in absolute, stony silence.
But the most brutal, unforgettable moment of the Salem witch trials belonged to an 81-year-old farmer named Giles Corey. Corey was a stubborn, wealthy man who realized that the court was using the trials to seize the land and property of anyone convicted of witchcraft, leaving their children completely destitute. To protect his family's inheritance, Corey did something completely unprecedented. He refused to enter a plea. He stood before the judges in absolute silence, refusing to say the words guilty or not guilty.
Under Old English law, a prisoner who refused to plead could not be legally tried. To force a confession out of the stubborn old man, the authorities subjected Giles Corey to a barbaric medieval torture known as peine forte et dure, or strong and heavy pain. He was taken to a cleared field near the jail, stripped completely naked, and laid flat on his back upon the hard, cold earth. A heavy wooden door was placed across his chest. Then, the executioner began lifting massive, jagged boulders from the stone walls and placing them, one by one, on top of the door. The weight was immense, slowly crushing his ribcage, pressing the breath out of his lungs and forcing his body into the dirt. The judges stood over him in the heat, demanding that he enter a plea to save his own life. But Giles Corey did not weep, and he did not scream. Every time the judges asked for his plea, the old man simply looked into their eyes through the agony and whispered the two words that would echo through American history: more weight. More stones were added until his chest collapsed entirely, and his tongue was forced out of his mouth. The executioner brutally pushed it back in with his wooden cane just before the final stone crushed the last breath out of his body. Giles Corey died an innocent, unconvicted man, his land successfully preserved for his children, leaving a permanent, bloody stain on the conscience of the Salem judiciary. The high humidity of late August brought no relief to Salem. Instead, the air grew increasingly putrid, heavy with the stench of disease from the overcrowded prisons and the unmistakable, lingering smell of death from Gallows Hill. By this time, the executioner's rope was working with terrifying efficiency. On August 19, a massive crowd gathered at the base of the rocky hill to witness the hanging of 5 individuals simultaneously, including a man whose execution would deeply shake the collective psyche of New England, George Burroughs.
Burroughs was not an uneducated peasant or a social outcast. He was a Harvard graduate and a former minister of Salem village itself. To the judges, however, his past leadership made him even more dangerous. They accused him of being the Black Minister of the Witches' Coven, the strategic mastermind sent by Satan to destroy the Puritan church from within. As Burroughs stood at the top of the wooden ladder, looking out over the sea of pale, frightened faces, he did something that a witch was theoretically supposed to find impossible. He began to pray.
With absolute calmness, clarity, and unwavering dignity, Burroughs delivered a flawless recitation of the Lord's Prayer. According to Puritan theology, the devil could never utter those sacred words without stuttering or screaming in agony. The crowd was visibly stunned. A low, trembling murmur washed through the spectators. Tears began to stream down the faces of hardened farmers, and many openly demanded that the execution be stopped immediately. Sensing a sudden shift in the crowd's energy, a young minister named Cotton Mather rode to the front on his white horse. Mather, a man of immense pride and theological ambition, addressed the weeping crowd with a sharp, booming voice. Do not be deceived. The devil is never more dangerous than when he transforms himself into an angel of light. Even a former minister can be a wolf in sheep's clothing.
His powerful rhetoric successfully hypnotized the crowd once more. The ladder was turned, and George Burroughs, along with 4 others, dropped to his death. Among the dead that afternoon was John Proctor, a wealthy, outspoken tavern owner who had consistently labeled the afflicted girls as liars and frauds. His pregnant wife, Elizabeth, was spared the rope only because the law forbade executing an unborn child. After the executions, the bodies were brutally stripped, dragged into a shallow, unmarked rocky trench on the hillside, and half buried, leaving their hands and feet exposed to the wild animals and the elements. A final, systematic denial of human dignity.
By September of 1692, the machinery of the Salem witch trials had become a monster that its own creators could no longer control. Over 150 people sat in dark, disease-ridden cells across the colony, and accusations had begun flying towards the most powerful echelons of society. The afflicted girls, intoxicated by their absolute power over life and death, grew dangerously reckless. They accused Lady Mary Phips, the deeply respected wife of the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips. They pointed their trembling fingers towards the elite merchants of Boston, the highest judges of the land, and even the prominent ministers who had initially supported the trials.
A profound, chilling realization began to dawn upon the people of Massachusetts. If the devil could truly take the shape of an innocent person without their consent through spectral evidence, then no one, not even the most pious saint or powerful ruler, was safe. The entire legal foundation of the trials was a trapdoor designed to swallow the entire colony. The first major intellectual blow against the madness came from Increase Mather, the influential president of Harvard College and the father of Cotton Mather. In a historic address to the ministers of Boston, he delivered a phrase that would eventually become a foundational pillar of modern Western justice. It would better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned.
Governor William Phips, recognizing that his own household and the political stability of the colony were on the brink of total destruction, finally stepped in. On October 12, 1692, he issued an official decree dissolving the court of Oyer and Terminer. The use of spectral evidence was strictly banned from all future legal proceedings. The screaming of the afflicted girls, which had carried the weight of life and death for nearly 10 months, was suddenly reduced to meaningless noise in the eyes of the law. The spell had been broken, and the long, painful awakening of an entire society had begun.
The winter of 1693 arrived not with a sense of triumph, but with a heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the snow-covered fields of Salem. The prisons were slowly emptied, and the remaining accused were allowed to return to their homes, but they returned to a world that was entirely ruined. Their lands had been left uncultivated, cattle had been seized by corrupt sheriffs, and their families were bankrupted by the endless prison fees. Neighbors who had whispered accusations against neighbors now had to pass each other on the narrow dirt lanes in absolute icy silence.
The collective guilt of the community was a physical weight. In January of 1697, the General Court of Massachusetts declared an official day of public fasting, prayer, and repentance for the tragedy of Salem. It was an unprecedented historical moment. An entire government openly admitting that it had acted as an instrument of mass murder. On that dark, cool day, Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the leading magistrates who had sentenced 19 people to the gallows, stood up before the congregation in the South Meeting House of Boston. As a minister read his written confession aloud, Sewell stood with his head bowed in deep humiliation, weeping openly before the public. he confessed that his mind had been blinded by spiritual delusion, that he had shed innocent blood, and he begged for the forgiveness of both God and the families of the victims. For the rest of his life, Sewell set aside one day every year for private fasting and prayer to atone for his immense judicial
In
sin.
1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the primary afflicted girls who had sent so many to their deaths, stood before the Salem Village Church congregation to formally beg for forgiveness. Now a frail, broken 26-year-old woman, she wept as her written apology was read aloud. "I desire to lie in the dust and to be humbled for it. It was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time, whereby I justly fear I have been instrumental with others, though ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon myself and this land the guilt of innocent blood." She was the only one of the accusers who ever publicly repented. She died unmarried just a few years later, her body buried in an unmarked grave, completely consumed by the psychological scars of her own childhood
The
deception.
shadows of 1692 never truly left the landscape of Salem, but the lessons carved into that dark New England earth would ultimately shape the destiny of a new nation. The tragedy of the witch trials became a powerful cautionary blueprint for the founding fathers of the United States. When they sat down decades later to draft the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the ghosts of Salem were directly in the room with them. The horrors of the special courts led directly to the institutionalization of fundamental legal protections that we take for granted today. The absolute right to legal counsel, the presumption of innocence until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and the strict cross-examination of physical, verifiable evidence rather than emotional or spectral testimony. The United States legal system was deliberately constructed to ensure that a localized panic could never again be transformed into a state-sanctioned execution machine.
Today, the modern city of Salem, Massachusetts is a place of bright neon lights, Halloween tourism, and commercialized witch aesthetics. But if you step away from the crowded tourist streets and walk toward the quiet, shaded corner of the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, the true weight of history returns. There, carved into massive, rough granite stones, are the names of the 20 innocent individuals who chose to have their bones broken under heavy rocks or their necks stretched on the gallows rather than lie to their God and compromise their human integrity.
As you step back into the comfort and security of your modern world, let the story of Salem linger in your thoughts, like the soft, dying embers of a fire. It is a reminder that the thin veneer of human civilization can be easily torn away whenever a society allows fear to dictate its laws, and whenever suspicion is elevated above objective truth. The true monsters of Salem did not wear black capes or fly through the midnight sky. They lived inside the quiet hearts of ordinary citizens who chose silence over courage and who allowed their own prejudices to blind them to the humanity of their neighbors. Sleep well tonight, surrounded by the beautiful protection of reason, justice, and light, knowing that the terrifying shadows of 1692 are safely preserved in the stone-cold archives of time.